Victorian England was a contradictory period of unprecedented progress and domestic unrest. The country luxuriated in the imperial expansion that signaled Europe's rise as a global economic superpower, but it was also a society of extreme inequality, overpopulated cities, and a strict moral code emphasizing gender roles, civilized behavior, and evangelical piety. Under Queen Victoria, Britain became the world's largest empire, boasting territories that spanned a quarter of the globe. The Industrial Revolution solidified Britain's reputation as the workshop of the world, renovating the nation through urbanization and a newfound confidence in human ingenuity. Environmental harm and ethical errors seemed a small price to pay for the world's first automated factories, mass producing prototypical tools like vaccines, the telegraph, steam engines, and box cameras. Such conveniences would help usher in modernity as the bedrock of contemporary health and social life. While industrialization fundamentally reshaped Europe's economic landscape, it also fostered an intellectual environment that questioned traditional views of stability and change. Led by figures like John Mill's utilitarianism and Thomas Huxley's agnosticism, this pivotal episode in early modern thought was driven by a humanist desire for the greatest good and the biggest profit, accelerating Europe through the expert application of technology, engineering, and medicine. The Victorian era was thus marked by the professionalization of science. Before then, science was called natural philosophy. Natural philosophers like Copernicus and Galileo spearheaded the scientific revolution by shifting away from the clerical authority of classical antiquity, replacing it with a pursuit of knowledge that was active and empirical. By the mid 19th century, natural philosophy only described independent practitioners who specialized in fields like physics, geology, chemistry, and biology. The term scientist was coined in 1833 to provide an official title and commemorate becoming a paid profession. Science itself proliferated as a highly competitive field of academic rigor, evidence based methods, and peer reviewed research. Professionalization also demanded a new kind of free thinker who was both a meticulous observer and a master of open debate. The ideal man of science was sober, affluent, rational, and authoritative enough to influence policy and public opinion. Due to educational and social barriers, women and minorities were heavily excluded from scientific communities. Predominantly white male gentlemen came to represent Europe's deep fascination with rapid evolving technologies and its anxiety toward unchecked intellectual advancement. Scientists themselves were not merely in the business of discovering facts. They were fighting for the cultural authority to interpret the natural world, often challenging traditional theological views. For example, the rise of the life and earth sciences cast a dark shadow of doubt over biblical literalism. Physics and the notion of cosmic time frames paired with the geological data to contradict Noah's flood and the 6,000-year-old earth. Still, many prevailing theological ideas remained in circulation. The hypothesis that launched a thousand careers was William Paley's watchmaker analogy, which posited that the universe's complexity points to a high probability of intelligent design. These challenges created a crisis of faith where some struggled to reconcile Christian orthodoxy with empirical evidence. The issue would lead to a profound, lasting impact on religion and Europe, with a decline in church attendance and an increase in liberal theology. But the widening schism between science and religion also forced a modernization of thought. Intellectuals worked to resolve their own beliefs, firmly planting themselves in progressive views on nature, humanity, and the divine. Caught between a world that seemed to be losing its religious anchoring and a future without certainty, Europeans transitioned toward modern skepticism, agnosticism, and alternative spiritualities. The newest religion on the block was scientific materialism, the idea that only physical matter and physical laws exist. This philosophy questioned Christianity's epistemic status. The synthesis of science and religion was replaced by a nostalgia to reunite their epistemologies like the days of classical antiquity. While this development caused the loss of traditional belief, it simultaneously forged a stronger, more internalized spiritual quest, replacing untouchable dogma with a requirement for personal proof. In this way, loss of faith was less of an acquiescence to materialism and more of a rocky transition toward enlightenment, laying the groundwork for modern atheistic worldviews that highlighted the human search for meaning in a fast paced, increasingly secularized society. The permanent legacy of this period transformed Christianity from a social mandate into a debatable worldview, setting the stage for religion in the 20th century. However, the democratization of religious belief and the legitimization of scientific materialism also became dominant and competing positions. Science and religion remained estranged, and whenever they met, it raised a simple yet profound question neither could answer alone. How can God create a world that is scientifically explainable without him? Standing at the epicenter of this seismic shift was Charles Darwin, an English gentleman who encapsulated the changeover from amateur naturalist to paid professional. What began as an innocent youth with little academic ambition outside of his curiosity for dissecting insects and collecting rocks would later shock Victorian England and then change the course of modern biology and Western thought with his theory of evolution by natural selection. In this lecture, we will explore the incredible life and legacy of this unlikely revolutionary. We will trace Darwin's influences from his formative years at university to the life altering 5 year voyage on the HMS Beagle. We will also explore how his observations of fossils, flora, and fauna inspired an earth shattering hypothesis that he would spend decades cautiously validating before finally publishing in his seminal 1859 book titled On the Origin of Species. Beyond Darwin's work on evolution, we will look at the man behind the myth, not the standard misconception of the lone genius who developed his theories in isolation, but the collaborative social networker who built upon existing scientific work, the devoted family man who struggled with illness, wrestled with the religious implications of his findings, and whose lifelong work placed him among the greatest scientists in history. By the end, you will be able to appreciate not just his gravitas and personal sacrifices, but also how America and Europe reacted to his widely received theory that all species, including humans, are connected through a branching tree of life. Charles Darwin, 1809 to 1882, possessed one of the most brilliant scientific minds of all time. He spent 25 years amassing data with hundreds of other scholars around the globe before marking a turning point in Western science with his magnum opus on the origin of species. In this watershed text, Darwin explains the origin of living organisms through the theory of descent with modification by natural selection, better known simply as evolution. Nearly 200 years later, debates continue to rage within science and religious corners regarding the factual nature of evolution, and the hypothesis itself undergoes frequent conjecture in other spheres of society. Despite the founding father's own robust faith background, his naturalistic leanings and godless explanations for life soon became the ammunition for agnostic ontologies, atheist rationales, and any sterile philosophy that rigidly separated scientific fact from fiction. His controversial postulations would ultimately surpass all of humanity's supernatural assumptions about life on Earth and thereby rattle the foundations of modern Western society. But Darwin himself was never a self proclaimed atheist hell bent on destroying Christianity. The story behind the theory of evolution comes on the heels of his own ambivalences about God's questionable existence and relationship to nature. Consequently, scholarly opinion concerning the impact of his faith formation onto the conceiving of evolutionary theory is more nuanced and central to Darwinian thought than historical scholarship admits or pop culture cares to remember. Darwin's personal religious leanings are shrouded in an abundance of inconsistent statements from public utterances and private letters, granting for multiple interpretations of the truth. Born into a middle class English family of doctors, Victorian gentleman Charles Darwin was a failed medical student at Edinburgh who despised unanesthetized surgery. He transferred to Christ's College at Cambridge, where he seemed poised for ordination, but the bachelor was more interested in horse riding, shooting ranges, and adding to his bug collection. Baptized in Anglican and steeped in his mother's Unitarianism, the Darwins were well established liberals. Their children grew up on principles of good scholarship, of a questioning faith, and of affirming both the sacred and the secular. Their father and grandfather were both distinguished physicians and borderline atheists who considered the Anglican Creed a relic of the superstitious past. This free thinking family treated disbelief not as a moral crisis, but as a necessary catalyst for inquiry. Although Dr. Erasmus Darwin died before his grandson was born, Charles would lovingly study his grandfather's book about organic life, the Zoonomia, around the 1820s. That is an important point to make. Charles Darwin introduced the mechanism behind evolution, but he did not single handedly discover it. Evolution was all the rage in Britain and France at least half a century prior. The term evolution was not popular to describe biological change until Herbert Spencer and his survival of the fittest philosophy in 1864, 5 years after Darwin published his book Origins. From childhood, Darwin was fascinated with the methodology of German botanist Alexander Humboldt and his extensive travelogues around Central America. It was Humboldt who informed Darwin's thinking and who inspired him to become a naturalist. As a seminarian, Darwin was also swept up in the 1802 movement ignited by William Paley. Paley described the universe's complexity as akin to finding a pocket watch on the ground and concluding that somebody designed it rather than assuming it formed by random chance. Similarly, because organic structures like the human eye are both complex and purposeful, they must have an intelligent creator. This zeitgeist was perfect for any natural philosopher interested in the history of life, and Darwin was equally attracted to the strict rationalism and empiricism that it demanded. Stuck at home after graduating from Cambridge in 1831 and facing a dismal future career in the family business, the 22-year-old biologist at heart dreamed of discovering himself on an exotic scientific odyssey like the bookshelf of explorers he read and emulated. That same year, Darwin's mundane life trajectory changed forever with the research opportunity to accompany Captain Robert Fitzroy as an intern on a global expedition aboard Her Majesty's ship, the HMS Beagle. His purpose was to be the resident naturalist, collecting specimens, rocks, and fossils, as well as observing the geology and flora of the locations they visited. Experiencing physical privation and mental rigor while seafaring and foraging would equip the juvenile, undecided genius with a newfound seriousness for life and a sobering awareness about the natural world. The voyage started on December 27th, 1831, at Plymouth Bay and ended on October 2nd, 1836, in Falmouth. For the next 5 years, Darwin sailed the British Royal Navy and was subject to the captain's compulsory Sunday sermons and impromptu homilies. Captain Fitzroy was an outstanding cartographer and naval officer who believed every word of Scripture. Despite the captain's best efforts, his companion Darwin remained highly skeptical of the literal Judeo Christian reading of Genesis. The refusal to accept creationism after circumnavigating the globe would slowly but surely unravel the little bit of faith he barely maintained. Darwin's departure from orthodoxy occurred on deck. There, he studied terrestrial organisms and marine invertebrates that he found around the South American coastline, the Amazon rainforest, West Africa, and Cape Verde's archipelago. 1 year before setting sail, English astronomer John Herschel published the major treatise A Preliminary Discourse on the Study of Natural Philosophy in 1830, where he showed that many diverse natural phenomena follow logically from just a few general laws of physics applied universally. Herschel became acquainted with Darwin aboard the Beagle, where he gave Darwin his blessing and referred to biodiversity on Earth as the ultimate mystery of mysteries. Darwin sought to prescribe God to Herschel's laws, but conceded that if science can prove various creatures around the globe and across time share ancestry, then it would seem unlikely that God created them separately. In addition, Darwin's leisurely reading material included that year's best selling book, Principles of Geology, a radical text that daringly poked holes in young Earth creationism by theorizing how life came to exist on the planet over vast geological ages, affording Darwin the time frames necessary for the temporal mechanisms of natural selection. Comparing different sized fossils of extinct mammals sparked the idea of mutability between species. Witnessing the aftermath of powerful earthquakes and volcanic eruptions revealed how geological movement shaped land formation and impacted the atmosphere. Inescapably, the more Darwin became convinced that life originated by chance and species develop over gradual modification, the less he could accept Old Testament creation or New Testament miracles as scientifically possible. He returned home completely unconvinced and secretly harbored devastating reservations about God in 1839 when the 27-year-old finally published his exploits in The Voyage of the Beagle. That autobiographical journal narrated Darwin's maritime excursions as a resident scientist aboard the British vessel, internally wrestling with doubts about supernaturalism and the dynamic quality of the material world. Seasickness often rendered Darwin dazing overboard onto the vast oceans and fever dreaming about its impossible depths. Tranquil moments were marred by intrusive thoughts about complex ecosystems teeming underwater where humans cannot see and appreciate the Creator. Anchored at the Galapagos Islands in 1885, Darwin's conundrum increased at first glance of the exceptional adaptive capabilities of flora and fauna within the exotic regional climate. During the 2 month trip, Darwin wondered why Galapagos finches have different shaped beaks when compared to other birds from continental South America. He slowly realized that certain animals were typical from one island to the next, and each had successfully adapted to their environment. He was also notoriously haunted by the sight of the ichneumon wasp that invaded caterpillar cocoons. The archipelago widened his eyes to a vicious Garden of Eden, where bugs devour other bugs, and the animal kingdom itself seemed to thrive under inhospitable conditions and utter chaos. For Darwin, predation and natural disasters were strong indications against beneficent design. Darwin eventually renounced Christianity, not because evolution ruled out the existential need for a creator, but partly because he struggled with the idea of an omnipotently good God relying on a bloody tool like natural selection. Most historians think that he was still a believer when he wrote his earliest manuscripts. According to James Moore, Darwin's text Origins was from start to finish a pious work against miraculous creation, but equally a theist case for creation by law. Theology was a vital accomplice to Darwinian thought when he published between 1837 and 1844. In Sketch on Natural Selection, Darwin writes about a being infinitely more sagacious than man who could mold organisms more for their benefit over time, either by his own direct foresight or by intermediate means. In other words, it seems that at best, Darwin was a follower of deism, the Enlightenment era rationalist philosophy that a supreme being designed the universe based on natural laws but does not intervene in its affairs. Deism emphasized reason over revelation and favored observing nature to understand the divine. Although he was an accomplished seminarian, Darwin's theology did little to satisfy the questions that kept him awake at night, thumbing through journals and comparing notes with his contemporaries. The exact meaning of his concept of natural selection changed slightly over the six editions of Origins between 1859 and 1872, and has given rise to numerous readings of the significance of this biological principle. But each edition sold out immediately, and most scientists welcomed and embraced his thinking that satisfied so many problems in biological science. But Orthodox Christians condemned his work as heresy. The controversy deepened with his 1871 text, The Descent of Man, in which he famously postulated that Homo sapiens are related to primates. Keenly aware that this idea would clash with established religion, the Origins text frequently responds to creationism viewpoints, showing how evolutionary theory explains certain phenomena better than baseless ideology, all the while remaining neutral about the existence of a divine creator. Still, vestiges of deism are present at the ending of the first edition of Origins. There, Darwin borrows from Genesis 2:7 to summarize his overall position that probably all of the organic beings which have ever lived on this earth have descended from one primordial form into which life was first breathed. This is important because Darwin's theory only explained how species change over time, not how life started in the first place. He deployed biblical language to convey that the first breath was an original divine act that set life in motion. To paraphrase the final pages of Origins, Darwin concludes that even if a creator did indeed exist at the very beginning, such an entity only sparked life into the first organism so that it could propagate and create more complexity over time through natural processes of variation, mutation, and natural selection. Evolution is thus an elaborate but straightforward process governed by discriminatory acts of nature. Darwin hypothesized that minor variations clearly seen between a single species, like shape, size, and color, reflect the most inheritable characteristics passed down over successive generations, and further speculated that natural selection was an imperfect procedure. Darwin's Origins book can be summarized in 5 points. 1. The world itself is neither constant nor recently created, but rather in a state of constant flux that gives rise to newly adapted entities. 2. Every group of organisms on the planet, cats, birds, trees, fish, humans, descend from prolific common ancestry. 3. Geographic isolation and ecological pressures can contribute to the branching of one species into another. 4. Population changes take place through gradual stages as opposed to the sudden production of new characteristics. And 5. In every generation, some individual organisms survive longer, and reproduce better than others. Darwin continued publicizing his philosophy of biology until his death at age 73 on April 19th, 1872. Plagued by an undiagnosable illness for decades after the Beagle voyage, he finally succumbed to the extreme fatigue, body aches, and intestinal swelling. By this time, his theory of evolution was so generally accepted and praised that he received the high honor of being buried at Westminster Abbey alongside English royalty and other illustrious figures from British history. Subsequent developments in genetics and molecular biology have refined and modified evolutionary theory over the centuries, but Darwin's original ideas remain central to the field. Most post Enlightenment scientists were religious in the sense of anthropomorphizing the universe and ascribing God to beauty in nature. That is, until Darwin forced them to reconcile the emerging contradictions and problematics brought on by further advances in naturalistic research. Generally, any respectable Victorian gentleman would at least feign religion so as not to alienate oneself socially. Nevertheless, Darwin in the final decades openly confessed the term agnostic, a word invented by his vociferous bulldog of a friend, the fellow biologist Thomas Huxley, who helmed the fight for the public's acceptance of evolution. Huxley's term agnostic allowed Darwin to articulate his inability to reach scientific certainty about the existence or non existence of God confessing in most extreme fluctuations, an agnostic would be the best correct description of my state of mind. Agnostics maintain that ultimate reality is unknown and probably unknowable, and that even science is incapable of providing sufficient rational grounds to justify belief in the divine and supernatural. This position suggests that humans are not central to creation, and thus morality is meaningless since there is no innate purpose to life or the universe. Darwin's final break from religion happened after the devastating loss of his beloved father in 1848 and his sickly daughter Annie 3 days after Easter in 1851. Darwin reflected on these crushing blows to his belief in God, lamenting that I can indeed hardly see how anyone ought to wish Christianity to be true. For if so, the plain language of the New Testament seems to show that unbelievers are everlastingly punished, and this is a damnable doctrine. Paired with his own debilitating mystery disease, the death of his favorite child soon after losing his father was even more hazardous to Darwin's faith and equally insalubrious to his confidence in Western medicine. Thus, Darwin's religious journey constantly backslid from Christianity because Dr. Robert Darwin's death had spiked the faith, and for good measure, Annie's made the point. The existence of disease and suffering failed to convince Darwin that a loving God would design such harsh conditions to the Earth's biosphere. Some found it unconscionable that Darwin died an unbeliever, and rumors swirled that he found absolution by renouncing evolution on his deathbed. James Moore produced an excellent historical refutation of that popular urban legend, tracing the roots of this grotesque gloss on real historical events to the embellishments of British evangelist Elizabeth Lady Hope Cotton, a strident worker of the anti alcohol temperance movement. According to James Moore, Darwin was neither bedridden nor ever particularly sentimental towards the Bible, and certainly would never have requested Lady Hope, of all people, to perform final rites, saying that the notion of him joining in the singing of gospel hymns outside his bedroom window is preposterous. Moore concedes that an actual meeting between Lady Hope and Darwin did take place, but probably for an entirely different reason. It is a lesser known fact that Darwin's final years were compromised by prolonged bouts of severe depression. His use of wine and tobacco to drown his sorrows betrayed a lifelong fear that he helplessly inherited alcoholism from his family lineage. Yet, regardless of Lady Hope's esteem as a prohibitionist, Emma Darwin would never have allowed such intrusive personal evangelizing over her husband's ailing body. The Darwin family consistently denied the deathbed legend, saying that any claim to recantation was an absurd lie. Darwin's theory of evolution was not entirely novel. The idea that plants and animals are the lineal descent of somewhat simpler life forms had existed rudimentarily since at least the Greeks. What Darwin did was give the theory its intellectual currency by providing a scientific, comprehensive interpretation to work within a scholarly and critical way. Some found it unconscionable that Darwin died an atheist, and rumors swirled that he found absolution by renouncing evolution on his deathbed. James Moore produced an excellent historical refutation of that popular urban legend, tracing the roots of this grotesque gloss on real historical events to the embellishments of British evangelist Elizabeth Lady Hope Cotton, a strident worker of the anti alcohol temperance movement. According to James Moore, Darwin was neither bedridden nor ever particularly sentimental towards the Bible, and certainly would never have requested Lady Hope, of all people, to perform final rites, saying the notion of him joining in with the singing of gospel hymns outside his bedroom window is preposterous. Moore concedes that an actual meeting between Lady Hope and Darwin took place, but probably for an entirely different reason. It is a lesser known fact that Darwin's final years were compromised by prolonged bouts of severe depression. His use of wine and tobacco to drown his sorrows betrayed a lifelong fear that he helplessly inherited alcoholism from his family line. Yet, regardless of regardless of Lady Hope's esteem as a prohibitionist, Emma Darwin would never have allowed such intrusive personal evangelizing over her husband's ailing body. The Darwin family consistently denied the deathbed legend, saying that any claim to recantation was an absurd lie. Darwin's theory of evolution was not entirely novel. The idea that plants and animals are the lineal descent of somewhat simpler life forms had existed rudimentarily since at least the Greeks. What Darwin did was give the theory its intellectual currency by providing a scientific, comprehensive interpretation to work with in a scholarly and critical way, admitting difficulties and removing them, foreseeing and forestalling objections, etc. To name a few, his research leaned heavy on predecessors who briefly approached natural selection in undefined terms, like Joseph Adams' A Treatise on the Supposed Hereditary Properties of Disease in 1814, and Dr. W.C. Wells' An Account of a Female of the White Race of Mankind, part of whose skin resembles that of a Negro, in 1818. His views were met with much resistance, and Darwinists continued to be challenged for believing humans and apes descend from the same family tree. Antoinette Blackwell and Eliza Gamble were just a few key 19th century women who directly challenged Darwin's claims about the intellectual and biological inferiority of women. Blackwell's 1875 book, The Sexes Throughout Nature, systematically refuted Darwin's sexual selection theories using his own framework. She argued that female physiology and reproductive systems have a more complex evolutionary function compared to males. Gamble's 1894 book, The Evolution of Woman, theorized that the female's power of choice in sexual selection implied superior levels of intelligence compared to males. Both women were part of a group of freethinkers in Europe and America who argued that Darwinian evolution, if properly understood, supported the emancipation of women. They believed that women should control their own reproduction and that it was natural for mothers to work outside the home. Their work, as detailed in Kimberly Hamlin's 2014 book, From Eve to Evolution, highlights how women's rights reevaluated Darwin's data to challenge the scientific, cultural, and religious prejudices of their time. Evolution was considered dangerous to the status quo of 19th century England because the theory worked fine without God and therefore threatened the prevailing views of the Anglican Church and society at large. The problem was not that evolution seemed contrary and bizarre, but that it made such logical and intuitive sense even to the layperson. Extrapolated beyond its role as a scientific theory, Darwinism can complement or contradict theology. But its logic also dictates that if God indeed exists, doctrines of God must align with truths of science. Once new theological paradigms became predominant in the sciences, an issue took center stage as critical thinkers reconciled an apparent teleology in purely random phenomena. Was God the divine clockmaker who fixed the cosmological gears and set Earth's biological cogs into motion, or is there just a perceived purpose built into natural processes? Only about a decade after Darwin's death, all the Western world except the American South subscribed to the tenets of evolution. Catholics and Protestants alike treated it as trivial common knowledge. After the Second World War, circumstances started to change. The 1961 text Genesis flood revived a definitive treatment of biblical literalism and instantly became a second Bible of the creation science movement. Its popularity gained the attention of secular biologists who railed against Genesis and weaponized evolution as the counterclaim. And many Americans still lobby against evolution being taught in public schools. Today, explanations for the existence of organic life on Earth fall under three camps: evolution, life developed from non organic matter through natural processes; creationism, a supreme being originated life and the universe in its present form from within the last 10,000 years; and intelligent design, irreducible complexity in nature best explained by direct godlike intervention as opposed to blind chance. Evidence of evolution is overwhelming, from carbon dated fossil records to the bacterial resistance of your overprescribed antibiotics. The simple yet profound, in your face proof of genetic mutation and environmental adaptation can be observed all around us and easily reproduced in the laboratory. Neo Darwinism in America emerged during the 1930s and 1940s as scientists integrated Gregor Mendel's theory of genetics, and the current accepted Darwinian Mendelian model has been modified significantly since then. Over the last 35 years, and despite countless fundamentalist objections, civic science and literacy among college graduates has strongly raised the public acceptance of evolution in the United States solidly above the halfway mark, according to a 2021 poll. Among other factors, a recent Pew Research study revealed scientific consensus varied by religious groups, with 60% of white evangelical Protestants twice as likely to say that humans have existed in their present form since the beginning. I recognize three tensions between Christianity and evolution. 1. Origin stories in ancient sacred texts. 2. God as creator of organic life. And 3. Vast suffering in natural selection. The ancient Greeks did not postulate origins in this way, but ancient Jewish thinkers did. So, when theologizing in purely naturalistic domains, we are confronted with glaring incompatibilities and subtle incongruencies between Darwinism and creationism in Judeo Christian tradition. Religious believers in this school of thought hold that God is responsible for creating the universe and sustaining all life within it. However, An implicit theodicy undergirds the fact that natural evil and biological suffering seem to be intrinsic to natural selection and to life itself. I am a PhD theologian who deeply admires the book of Genesis as an exegete and a lover of ancient sacred texts. I am even more amazed that the cousins of primates can acknowledge our own existence, write poetry, and conduct scientific experiments. The evolutionary worldview can be an affirmation that God did not just create things in the past, but continues spinning something out of nothing, as each new birth of every organism on life on Earth features a genetic code hitherto non-existent. If Darwinism indeed effectively killed God by weakening religion, then how do we organize society in lieu of a transcendent moral arbiter telling us right from wrong? God only ever offered the shiny promises of an afterlife. At Darwin's post Enlightenment advent, what was rational became good, and what was irrational became bad. Since then, common sense in the West dictates that rationality and science alone can solve all human crises, including morality. In summary, Charles Darwin did not just exist within the limits of Victorian England, he shattered them. By transitioning from a world defined by rigid social hierarchies and literal biblical interpretations to one governed by natural selection and gradual evolution, Darwin profoundly altered the intellectual landscape of the 19th century. The same society that found pride in moral certainty and industrial progress was forced to confront a crushing new reality that humanity was not a separate creation, but just one twisting branch in the unfolding tree of life. Darwin bridged the gap between the traditional European worldview and the modern scientific age, replacing the outdated idea of static nature with a dynamic one, forever changing the world. Darwin was in many respects an accidental agnostic whose own skepticism advanced slowly over a lifetime of disbelief and disillusionment. He was convinced of William Paley's natural theology movement while preparing for ordination at Cambridge, but the preeminent and liminal impact of zoological and botanical study abroad left him sick and vacillating for the next 40 years. After 4 decades of carefully observing living organisms, ancient fossils, and natural evil, coupled with the heartbreaking jolt of loss and personal sacrifice, Darwin, and subsequently his followers, could no longer subscribe to faith in an all good and all loving Creator God.